So hi everyone, a warm welcome to you all, to my friends, colleagues, and all those participants here. Uh, so this session is produced by Friends of Elephants, and we have a very amazing session ahead by Arjun Kamdar and is Miss Ishika. And most of you have known exactly what is Friends of Elephants, but who don't know. Let me say, Friends of Elephants is not an organization and is not proposing to become one. It is an informal group of people coming together with varied expertise concerned about elephants and other wildlife. The group is a forum for expo- sorry. The group is a forum for disseminating knowledge and other wildlife coming from different. Uh, is it audible?
Yes, Karan,
Yes,
it's all
sir.
good.
Yeah, we can hear you. Well,
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So we have been this is basically just gathering information from different aspects and thus putting it for the layman people, so like students, researchers, and those who are new to the field. And the main motive of this Friends of Elephant talk is so that people are a lot more interested towards conservation and all, so and like take a healthy part in this conservation field. uh, Before we proceed, so this schedule is there will be introduction by me. Hi, I'm Karan Barman, and then we will have a talk on the topic just elephant methods by Mr. Arjun Kamdar. Later on, we will have a very healthy conversation between Miss Ishika Ramakrishna and Arjun Kamdar on the conversation of interaction between social species. And lastly, we will have a Q&A session by Miss Aksha Chowdhary. So before we move on, I will request everyone to switch off their mics. And have a very healthy conversation ahead in the Q&A session. So hi, I'm Karan. I am currently working as a research assistant with the Pygmy Conservation Program, a collaborative initiative by Aranyak and the Daryl Wildlife Conservation Trust. My master's, I have a qualification in Bachelor of Science in Zoology and MSc in Zoology with specialization in fisheries and aquaculture. Since October 2023, I have been working in the Manas National Park in Assam, primarily focusing on radio telemetry and reintroduced pygmy hawks, tracking their movement and studying habitat use. I am also involved in habitat restoration and of grasslands that support and contribute to the recovery of the pygmy hawk, one of the world's most endangered mammals, as well as restore Assam's unique grassland ecosystems. I also have a great interest for birds and wildlife photography. Today, I am introducing the event and I am pleased to do so. Um, Moving on to our next topic is just Elephant Matters by Mr. Arjun Kamdar. Before I hand over to Mr. Arjun, I will like to formally introduce yours to also. So Arjun Kamdar is an applied conservation scientist using an interdisciplinary approach to understand how human and animal behaviors can be individually and jointly targeted to architect a safe shared space. He has worked on a range of projects in Assam, combining elephants ecology with human behavioral science to help people and elephants coexist. He is currently doing an MPhil at the University of Cambridge, exploring the use of behavioral science to better understand decision making and the levers of change in complex social ecological systems. So now I'll hand over to Mr. Arjun.
All right, thanks, Karan. That was great. I'll just share my screen so
Yeah,
it's easy
I'll
to
stop
follow.
sharing this.
All right. All right, is that visible and am I audible?
You're
yes,
audible.
Arjun. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
perfect. Okay, great. Thanks. I'm very happy to be here. And today I'll just give a quick overview on some of the work that we've been involved with and some ideas, most something that I would really like everybody here to, think about, reflect on, discuss, debate, because these are just some ideas that are forming. So I think it would be nice to see what people think and how they go ahead. So please feel free to, put in your questions. I don't know whether this allows you to interrupt. There aren't too many people, so we might be able to have a conversation as well. But just feel free to put in your questions, thoughts, comments in the chat, right? So the first bit is Gaja and Prajah. So that means elephants and essentially people. And this is not a term that I have come up with. This is from the Elephant Task Force report that was put together by the Ministry of Forests in India in 2020. And as many of you know, about 55 to 70% of elephant habitat is outside protected areas. So that means a majority of where elephants are today are outside protected areas. And that means that their conservation and their conservation and persistent survival as a species is contingent on human action as well. And that, and as you know, Assam is no different, and it's very similar with the majority of elephant habitat being outside protected areas in tea estates, in shared landscapes, in paddy fields, in along river banks, etc. Now, it's really interesting to think of this from the perspective of this individual elephant. This is Bardoi, an elephant, a large male that we had been following as part of our work for several years. And he had a large home range, and it spanned right from the foothills of the Himalaya to the Brahmaputra. And I'll show it in the map in the next few slides. But just to think that he's about 40 years old. Oops, I think that's coming at the wrong time, but he's about 40 years old and has been traversing this landscape for that long, and has been moving through. And it's of course now with these reduced habitats, etc., the level of conflicts have increased, as you can see here, with people losing a lot of crops, property. These are schools that are broken in by elephants, including Bardoi, in search of rice, because this is where the midday meal grain is stored, which I'm sure many of you who have worked in Assam would be familiar with. Breaking houses. This is an elephant footprint, and the baby was sleeping. So this is not a staged photo. This was exactly how it was. And of course, elephants also perish in this aspect. Now, Bardoi has been moving through this landscape for such a long time. And in his own lifetime, we shall see he's seen a lot of changes. Now, the title of this talk is Just Elephant Matters, because we often tend to think of elephant conservation by putting the focus on the elephant. But given that this is such a shared landscape with a majority, being sharing spaces with humans, etc., it's really important to think about the justice aspect of this, both from just a pure, ethical and humanitarian perspective of people who share and bear the costs of living with these large animals, and also from the animals' perspective. So, these socially just elephant conservation leads to a much more stronger and efficient system, and some ideas which we'll see in the next few slides. So here's Bardoi, and this is virtually his entire range. Now, if you see, this is satellite imagery from 1984, and I'd like to draw your attention to the center of this, left of center of this map, where you can see there's, a dense forest patch, Sonai Rupai Wildlife Sanctuary. In 1993, you can see there's been some amount of loss. 99, a lot more. In 2001, even more. And by 2007, about 62% of elephant habitat has been cleared. This was due to a range of social political movements in the country, which is, and in the region particularly, which is a different question. But just to give you perspective, so in his own lifetime, he has had to adapt to 62% of his habitat disappearing. And then it's stabilized. And this is what it looks like. So it's not even got any fragments or small bits of forest. It's entirely converted to agriculture. So it's not really elephant habitat. Now, this also coincides in this region of the north bank of Assam, the Sonitpur, Biswanath districts, with an increase in human-elephant conflicts. But what really causes this? there are two broad categories. One is what is known as push factors, which is that there just isn't enough forage or nutrition available in the forest that remains, and elephants are virtually pushed out in search of nutrition and access to resources. And the other aspect is a pull factor, which is that elephants are attracted to human resources. They are pulled towards them, particularly rice, which is, and if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because rice is something that we as humankind have been making more and more tasty, more and more nutritious since the past several thousand years. So, understandably, elephants also could have a liking to that. So, to really understand this question better, because this can help inform policy, right? If it is largely push factors, it's about restoring habitats, about making sure there is enough and adequate nutrition inside the protected areas throughout the year. And if it is pull factors, it's about having better barriers and systems to ensure that elephants are not moving out and causing a lot of damage, despite having options inside the protected area. And this is most exacerbated in this landscape where human elephant conflicts are seasonal and they peak when the paddy is at its ripest. So to do this, the Assam Forest Department, WWF India, and a bunch of other collaborators, NGOs, and individuals came together to radio collar elephants. And how this works is you put a GPS collar around a wild elephant, which transmits data to a satellite, which then transmits it to a handheld device, a laptop or a mobile phone. So you can understand where the elephant is across the landscape, including times when we can't see it. For instance, when the elephant enters the protected area, some of these are really dense rainforests, so it's very difficult to keep track and understand the movement patterns. So this really helped. And after several months and years, in fact, of trying and failing, the first elephant was collared in 2021. Her name was Tara. And you can see this is just a plot of all the areas that she has traveled in less than a year. You can see that, of course, she's inside the patch of forest that remains, but also in tea estates and paddy fields, moving all through. This is a more zoomed in version, and you can see these are very heavily populated regions with a lot of people sharing spaces. And here are some more tracks. And I find this extremely telling, right? These, what you see here, where the pin is and the tracks on either side are elephant footprints as viewed from space. And I went to the houses on either side and I asked, do elephants move by over from here? And they said, yeah, of course they do. Maybe about 7 to 8 elephants every, 4 or 5 days, every week or so they move by. But through our telemetry work and through also tracking them, they move out at night. We knew that this was not the case. It was about 80 elephants moving through every single night, and people didn't know. So that just goes to show that elephants have adapted to this changing landscape. And there is still some adaptations and behavioral shifts that are needed for humans to share this space safely with elephants. And this movement, through these areas now, from the foothills of the Himalaya to the river islands of the Brahmaputra, are things that have been happening for a long time. We have records from the early 1900s as this, where there was an elephant capture camp. These are from notes by P.D. Tracy. It was called the Gelgeli Depot, and that's how they used to capture wild elephants, and they have recorded this movement since then. So this movement has been happening well before this loss of forests. So how is that happening? What is the reason behind this? The jury is still out on that. We don't have enough data to really know what's happening, but we do know that it has been happening. There are lots of hypotheses floated, but we don't really know what works. But now, either way, whatever might be the ultimate causes of elephants spending more time in human areas, the core question is how can we help people and elephants share spaces safely? The first and most intuitive idea is, of course, that you prevent and try and reduce the losses that people suffer, both people and property. Keep people safe, injuries, etc., deaths, and also property like crops, houses, and the things we saw earlier in the presentation. And one of the key solutions for that is a a fence, a non-lethal electric fence. Now, this is a single strand fence. It's highly effective in Assam. In other parts of India, not yet, because elephants have learned to overcome this. So what happens is that this is put around a village or a crop field, and when an elephant comes in contact with it, they get a non-lethal jolt. They get a really high shock, which is painful, just to kind of keep them away. It's a psychological barrier. Now, this is often given to communities and farmers and people who live here by an NGO or by the state, that is the forest department, with the condition that they maintain the fence. You need to clear the undergrowth, make sure that the battery is working all right. Not a lot of work, doesn't cost much as well, takes a little bit of time to do. But yet there was a problem, which was despite being very effective when well maintained, people, not all people maintained the fences. About 66% of them were had failed because people just did not maintain them. So we wanted to understand to what degree is this because elephants have learned to overcome this, and to what degree is it because people found it difficult to coordinate amongst one another and decide on a maintenance system. So we found, at least in this landscape, through a series of both ecological and sociological tools, that elephants here, like we did a bunch of interviews, participant observations, spent a lot of time in these landscapes trying to understand how decisions are made, what's really happening, those kind of things. And we found that elephants have still not learned how to overcome these fences. It's just that people find it difficult to get together. So based on these findings, and of course, if there are questions, we can go a little deeper into what these particular interventions were and what the changes were. For instance, how do we move from a purely social norms based system to also a little bit of market norms to ensure that the people have a sense of ownership? How did we decide on what should be the contribution for each household in the community? It shouldn't be too low so that people don't think it's worth it and it's too much of an expense to go and collect, 10 or 15 rupees from each household. And it shouldn't obviously be prohibitively high, 4, 5, 700 rupees, which people cannot afford. So how do we find that Goldilocks spot? And that's what we had worked on a little bit as well. And again, we can pick up on these threads in the questions if there are any. And while doing this work, we also saw an opportunity for some more in-depth idea as to understanding how human behavior works in these landscapes. How are people making decisions? And in conservation, the classic idea is, there are a few levers of change, and what it depends on each context is somewhat different from each other, right? So what are the specific motivators and opportunities for change in that landscape? And in general, in conservation, many people have found that we use three main levers of change. One is material incentives, which is like either incentivize people or disincentivize them through fines. The other one is, which I think is the most commonly one, which is tell them, there's an information deficit, a cognitive fix. Just give people information or awareness, and the problem will be solved. And the other is, of course, rules and regulations. Make rules, ramp up enforcement. Now this is what has been used conventionally in conservation, but there are also, from social marketing, psychological theory, behavioral science, we know that there are other levers as well, such as social norms and influences. How other people are doing, what other people are doing, what other people believe to be important, is and what other people believe to be a good thing has an impact on what people do. How choices are portrayed to people. What is the structure? This is like when you go to a supermarket and you see that there are these small toffees at the checkout. You just pick one up, and we see that even at the kirana shops, Gilamal dukans in Assam. And the last one is, of course, emotional appeals. You feel affect and emotion towards a certain thing, either positive or negative, and that plays a role in how you behave and make decisions. So using that, we co-created and co-developed a range of interventions and outreach material for tea estates, because a lot of these tea estates are eco-certified by organizations like Trust Tea and Rainforest Alliance, etc., where they are mandated to spend a certain amount of money on undertaking these kind of outreach work, posters, signboards, all of that. So we said, if that's anyway happening, how can we make it more catered to this particular audience of tea estate residents? And this is an example. I'm sure many of you who have been to Assam know that elephants also break into houses for alcohol, lau pani, and rice where it is stored. And that's photos of what we saw earlier. And what sometimes would happen is elephants would come at night because that's when they're least likely to be detected, and they would break the wall down. If somebody is sleeping there, the wall falls on them and they get injured or even perish sometimes. So we said, why don't we store the rice and the rice wine and the laupani in a separate room, so that even if the elephant does come, the wall doesn't fall on you. Um, and this is an example of what that looks like. When the elephant came, broke in, and you can see clearly how the damage happens. Here we try to tap into social norms, and again, this was all co-developed together and had several iterations. What should the framing be? What should the messaging be? How should people be depicted? Those kind of things. And here, as many of you are aware, in Assam, young boys find it quite fun to chase elephants just for fun. And that obviously is not a great idea. It's dangerous for the young boys themselves, but it also is known to increase stress levels in elephants, which some people suggest could lead to more damages for others. So, to say that what you do here can have an impact on your community elsewhere. And in this entire process, we also saw that when elephants break in houses, there are a few options before people. Like, for instance, in this tea estate house, they can apply to the tea estate management to repair the building. In other cases, they can apply to the state government. However, we know that that's not, that doesn't necessarily play itself out well, where, people often don't get compensated again. And what they do get is an ex gratia rather than compensation, which means it's a small sum of money to kind of help you tide over the difficulty, but it's not really something that makes good the loss. So, however, there still is something. But in many cases, what happens is elephants break in and in the process damage non-necessity goods, which is not the building, but things like, as you can see here, the television or mobile phones, fans, or in one case, the photo frame that one woman had of her father, and who had long passed away. And that led to a lot of anger against the elephant. And we, as generally we tend to think as um, this, it's not an equation as to the negative attitudes and perceptions that people have towards elephants is directly proportional to the material and economic loss that they faced. Many things like these emotions play a role. And so, like one person in our work told us that now the mobile phone is way more important than a roof, because I can make do with a roof here and there, but without a mobile phone, I feel so helpless. It is an integral part of people's lives. So, so the idea was to kind of create a small fund which can help people make good these losses, help repair a TV, repair the fan, those kind of things. And this is still being tested. It's not really rolled out the way we would have liked it to, but there are three local people who live in this landscape who have been at the forefront of human elephant coexistence work over the past several years, and they can decide when and how to use this fund to help people go replace and repair their non-necessity goods that have been damaged by elephants. And we raised a little bit of money for this through the sale of this photograph that a good colleague of mine and friend Siddharth Agarwal had taken. It's a beautiful photo of, Tara, the elephant that we call her, with stars in the background, crossing a railway track in this landscape to kind of put some money towards this fund. So that was also one way that we kind of tried to do this. Now, I feel, when as conservationists and in practice, we tend to use words like choosing the flagship species and flagships, individuals, etc. And there are a whole host of these. There can be a flagship individual, a flagship species. When it's a bunch of species, we call it a fleet. Sometimes it's entirely fictional. In some cases, it's an event. Some cases, it's a process. So there are lots of these flagships. When do we use what? So in this paper, we really try to figure out and try and give a framework for how to decide what to choose when. But I would like to just give you a couple of quick examples of this. So this is from South India, where there was this wild elephant, Chinnatambi, who had gotten very habituated to human areas. And this is not a unique thing. This happens all across elephant range in the subcontinent for sure. And he was suggested to be a potential threat. He hadn't yet harmed anybody at that point, but because he was so habituated to humans, literally moving through villages and towns, people said he could be a threat, so he should be taken into captivity. And that led to a huge uproar with the Save Chinnathambi campaign, with literally thousands of people opposing this. And, there was a big back and forth. It went to court. Unfortunately, Chinnathambi was made a captive elephant, broken and beaten into submission, and, was there. And then there was another similar one from South India, Arikomban. Exactly same traits, not harmed anyone. But for him, it was slightly better. He was radio collar was put on him, and then he was released back into the wild. And as far as I know, he still is, he still remains wild. So this is just to say that that individual elephants can also have a disproportionately large impact on the narrative and movement for conservation. And we've seen that with tigers, with bears, with a lot of different things, with flamingos. And I would like to talk a little bit about an elephant that I had been spending a lot of time with, Ramu, or Laden as he's known in this landscape. Sometimes he used to be called Laden, but then they said that's too negative a name for his traits, and they renamed him to Ramu. And he was also a very strong character, virtually never retaliated in the recent past. Even when children used to hit him with a stick at the back, he was like the Pied Piper, kind of walking through villages and people following him, screaming and shouting, and he would be unperturbed. He also had rescued an elephant while we were collaring elephants. We had darted a female and everything was perfect. We were just going to approach her to place the collar on her when Ramu came out of the blue and nudged her awake out of sedation. And despite us screaming, shouting, bursting crackers to make him go away because we really needed to collar her, but he just went straight for her and rescued her away from us. And our collaring failed because of this. Again, if anybody's interested, you can read it here. And he really had a special place in people's hearts in this landscape. Everybody loved him. There are lots more videos and photos of him on people's phones. Tens of thousands of people, I'm sure, were touched by his life. But unfortunately, he came in contact with the sagging wire a few months ago and passed away. Now, I'm this is the last bit, and I just want to, we're doing good on time, so that's good. I just want to, kind of draw and think a little bit about how we do conservation. And I think of it as this, I use this analogy, I feel that's helpful to see, which is we're trying to build a house, which is a good, effective conservation policy, one that lasts long, is good, has our goals, all those different goals in mind. And each subfield that we take within that is like a brick. So for instance, if we focus only on ecology, only on elephants ecology, it's like we get the best quality mud and we know exactly how well this brick, how we can make this brick really well and really strong and really robust. But at the end of the day, it's just a brick, and we need lots of bricks to come together to build this house. And that could be from insights from, psychology, from anthropology, from negotiation theory, all of those things. And most importantly, we need an overarching theory that ties all of these together. Otherwise we'll just have a pile of bricks, which means nothing. We want a well-designed house. And that's where, an interdisciplinary, a transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, but many discipline theory can come in place to kind of help us in this process. Okay, thank you.
So that's a very amazing talk. I guess most of you has very much too much of questions regarding this talk. Please drop in the chat box so that we can discuss it the later in the session. So moving on towards the next topic is a conversation between Miss Ishika Ramakrishnan and Arjun Kamdar. So before I, sorry, this is not, yeah. So before I jump into the thing, let me introduce Ishika. Ishika is a fifth-year doctoral fellow at the Center for Wildlife Studies. Her academic and applied interests lie in the interdisciplinary space across ethnoprimatology, social sciences, citizen science, science communication, and conservation education. She is an active member of several collaborative science communication projects and capacity building groups. In the spirit of storytelling and academic communication, Ishika has also written children's books and hosts a nature podcast, A Thing About Wildlife. Just to open the conversation, I would like to ask both Ishika and Arjun to give us an insight on how associated beliefs with elephants and gibbons can drive conservation, as Ishika has also worked with gibbons. So handing over to Ishika and Arjun.
Thanks. Thanks, Karan.
Thanks, Karan. Arjun, why don't you go first? I think I mean, it continues well from what you were just talking about.
Well, okay, thanks. Yeah. So I feel there are lots of overlaps at a foundational level, at a fundamental level in the two species, both highly sentient, which have a strong connection which people have a strong connection to, including individuals, including the broad context that they're set in, which is these heavily fragmented habitats that have happened, and this fragmentation has happened in the individual's lifetime, which is what Ishika, and I had been talking about for a long time as well. There's so many parallels. So I feel these are just some ideas and some thoughts on how these things are similar. And I would love to hear from Ishika. Maybe if you want to help give people an idea about what you're working on, what kind of questions that would be helpful.
Sure. I think, I mean, it's always such a joy to hear you talk, Arjun. And also because I think for many years now, I think safely we can say for the last 5 to 6 years, comfortably, Arjun and I have had so many conversations about how similar our work is in terms of themes. I think, if you take the exact same narrative that Arjun just presented, and if you replace the elephants with gibbons, it's very similar to the work that we do. So I see there's also Luja on the call here, and Luja and I have been working in Tinsukia in Assam with the Western Hoolock gibbons, and we've also been really deep diving into the behavior of the gibbons, understanding their very complex relationships with local communities there, and trying to figure out what are the different factors that have affected their lives over the years. And one of the biggest themes, of course, is that like elephants, gibbons are also very intelligent, sentient beings. They're long-lived species. I think what was so incredible in terms of how similar the shared narratives are when we were chatting about what we'd like to talk about on this particular in this session. Arjun and I realized how we've both been studying an individual who's around 40 years old, and within their lifetime has seen the transformation of their home from forest to now tea gardens and rural landscape, and almost converting now into a town as well. And so while Arjun has an elephant he's been looking at through that lens, we have a gibbon we've been looking at through the very same lens. And I think uh, to add to that complexity, elephants, gibbons, and people, or you really have to look at human beings as one of the species here rather than a separate entity. Because while elephants and other sentient beings like gibbons have been navigating these changing landscapes, adapting to them, coming up with new ways to problem solve, find food, resources, shelter, find ways to continue leading full, meaningful social lives amidst so much change. Uh, in the exact same way, people have had to navigate the same challenges. In people's own lifetimes, when we do our more anthropological side of things, where we go and speak to people, we do ethnographic work with people, we talk to older generations, and they tell us, "Ha, hamare zamane mein aisa tha," right? When we were children, it was like this, and now it is like that. And if we could talk to the elephants and gibbons, they would share similar stories. So I think what's so beautiful about this, and also very worrying about a lot of the systems we work in, is just how much change a single individual, human or non-human, has had to navigate within their lifetime. And how many times can you adapt? How many times can you adjust and change? And just because you can adapt and change, does that mean you should? Does that mean it's okay or manageable? Because you also then have to start asking the question, up to what point can adaptation kind of go hand in hand in real time with changes? Because we're going to reach a tipping point where the change is so drastic that even deeply intelligent and adaptive creatures may not be able to keep up, humans included, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ishika. That's really interesting. And I have I have a bunch of questions, but let me just start with this one. In your practice as a scientist as well, how do you view this idea of anthropomorphism? As scientists, we are kind of taught that that is not a good thing to do, but in conservation practice, I feel that this is something that is implicitly used very often. I hadn't watched a lot of documentaries growing up, and I recently did watch a few, and I realized that all of these BBC, Nat Geo, all of them, they talk about larger topics and ideas and deforestation, all of that, but they always do it through the story of an individual. Like, look at this baby seal, this poor walrus, this individual. And I wonder how you kind of view these things and navigate them.
I think likewise, I definitely want you to also reflect on this from your experiences. But I think from what I've seen, it is extremely context dependent. When we're talking about it at a very local scale, directly local communities that are interacting with these beings and individuals on a day-to-day basis, their anthropomorphism takes a slightly different form, because it's not just viewing some individual as cute in order to evoke that empathy to make you want to preserve or connect, conserve them. It's also that when anthropomorphism comes into the picture, human beings have a tendency to have the same moral expectations of a non-human as they would of a human. And
Mhm.
that's where it gets very tricky. The moment you think that a gibbon or an elephant or a monkey or any other non-human being that you're interacting with, if you relate to them as a human being, and if you think that they share the same behaviors and value systems, the moment the non-human crosses a line that you would not expect a human being to cross, and it can be as simple as crop foraging, right? And then people feel that this animal came and stole my food,
Mhm.
but that animal does not know that it belonged to the human being, or that it was stealing, right? So the intentionality is something which is very different, whether, depending on somebody, whether anthropomorphism exists or not. But at the same time, it's done very beautifully and seamlessly sometimes, and it can be helpful, because anthropomorphism can also be a tool through which people can relate to the animal that they're interacting with and living alongside, and it helps them identify with the plight of that being and with how much they are going through, or it helps them understand why they're coming into their homes and lands and farmlands, and why they need this food. So it is a little hard to navigate that line. I think when you look at it at a global marketing kind of a scale, there's a lot more of it that we see, which is, put a cute, uh, you know, baby elephant on, the cover of something, and, people are going to feel more empathy for it. And then, of course, I think you brought it up really well. How do we choose flagship individuals or flagship species, and how do we use them to, you know, create a conservation model and design conservation efforts around a particular being? Very often you need to invoke empathy there. And the go to is anthropomorphism. You know, kind of show a sad little baby, cute charismatic species there, and then it does the trick is for certain audiences. But if you take it
Absolutely.
down to the local level, I think it gets more complex.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I totally resonate with the idea that you have these expectations of animals as well, then. And I think there's some work in macaques as well, but I've seen it in elephants too, where elephants, when they're passing through, when elephants eat a little bit of crops, people are okay. But if the same amount of crops are lost to elephants passing through and not eating, there is a lot more anger that these elephants just destroyed it and didn't even eat it. What's the so absolutely. And I think like you say, with these shared landscapes and shared stories with people, one of the most common narratives in Assam and as well as in North Bengal is what can the elephant do? I'm obviously translating here. It has such a big stomach. We have such a small stomach and we work so hard to fill it, but an elephant, it's so big. Imagine how hard it needs to, so there is
Right.
that bit as well, which I guess is inevitable when you share such space over such long times together as well. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point, and I think that's a theme that comes out a lot, which is as Indians, even though cultures are so different from state to state, or even, I mean, 5 kilometers here and there, cultures vary so much. But
Yeah,
one common thread that you kind of find across many regions of the country is that we look at feeding and providing through food as a means of caring, whether it is for another human being or for another species. And which is why we see so much feeding of animals across different Indian cultures, right? And
absolutely.
this, the what you just mentioned of if they're passing through and they're destroying it without even eating, then it feels like a bigger loss. And that's something we've also kind of documented with how people view macaques or langurs versus gibbons. And it has to
Mhm.
do with their basic ecology, where macaques live in such larger groups and troops, and they end up, the way in which they forage is very different, where they'll pluck something first, they'll taste it. If they don't really like it or if it's not ripe yet, they'll drop it and it gets wasted. But gibbons are a little different in that they live in smaller nuclear families, and they're a little more cautious in their foraging tactics because there's not as much competition for resource, right? So they have the liberty to take their time, check if something is ripe or not pluck it if it isn't yet. And so overall, there is this perception that there's less wastage. So just on that
Right.
grounds itself, there are so many people who have told us that the macaques waste. And if the macaques were eating everything that they found in our farms, it would be okay because then at least we'll feel that we fed a hungry animal, and they needed
Yeah.
something. They didn't, they don't have jungle anymore. They don't have their own food anymore. So if they had to come here and eat our food, at least we would understand that and we'll feel happy कि we fed them. But they're not doing that. They're wasting it. That's why the gibbons are better. They're nicer. They don't waste food. They only eat as much as they want. So that leads to a big difference in how they perceive these species and how much they're willing to protect them and preserve them as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I know that there is some a bit of archaeological work as well, which has shown that, the reason why megafauna survived in India while in the rest of the world, particularly Europe, etc., it went is because there was some aspects of culture where, there was co-living, cohabiting, co-adapting in some sense, and there was this culture. And I see it most salient here now. I'm in the UK now, and I meet a few European conservationists every now and I feel that the contexts are just so different. For instance, uh, I mean, their large carnivore, their large mammal conservation is about wolves.
Yeah,
And one of the big challenges that somebody shared was that, this animal came in through the village, to the town, and we didn't know whether it was a wolf or a dog. And then the moment they figured out it was a wolf, they shot it. So
yeah,
it's just such a different, and that's not to say that, oh, there's this their problems are small or to belittle it, but to say that context and culture matters so much in how we perceive these things. So that's something to also keep in mind, and again look at this larger idea of the theory that we want to have that helps us build this house,
yeah.
to tie all of these bits together.
No, absolutely. And I'd also like to know more about what you think about this topic, the difference in how we perceive wildlife, and not just wildlife in itself, but living alongside it. And we find a huge disparity there because when you only look at the academic literature and what's out there, we've ended up kind of adopting this conflict culture and terminology, which was entirely developed and birthed in the global north, right? In
Yeah.
US and UK, where there is this concept that inherently it is unnatural for human beings to live with wildlife or close to wildlife and have to interact with them. And so it gave rise to terms like tolerance, right? Where if people are anywhere close to especially large mammals, um, and they're not killing them or engaging in any negative behaviors, it's called tolerance. And that basically means that inherently you're not supposed to want to be anywhere close to animals. And I find that really interesting, especially when that gets adopted into when we are working in places like Assam, where as you showed such incredible photos in your talk, right? And it just is so stark how much overlap there is in space when it comes to how elephants are using this space, how people are using this space, and like you said, just how incredibly elusive these massive creatures can be, right? They're just 80 of them moving in the uh, shelter of darkness, and people don't even know, because there's also a limit to how much people can notice or will notice given how these landscapes are being shared. And like, I also found some similar aspects where so many ethical guidelines of how we work with wildlife have been developed in places like the UK, right? Where they say you need to maintain a minimum of 50 meters from your study subject. And we have so many spaces in our field sites, in the places where we work and in the places where people live, where there genuinely isn't 50 meters that you can put between you and your study
Yeah,
species.
absolutely.
So yeah, I don't know, you can maybe I'd love to know what you think about these
No,
ideas
I
as well.
totally agree. I totally agree that I feel that the language and this paradigm, this worldview is not necessarily reflective of how systems are in India. And I mean, I think there is a good amount of work that has been done that has looked at this historically and epistemologically, where we're looking at why this happens. And I guess some ideas, one of the ideas is that, this Judeo-Christian thought process of man having dominion over nature, this clear
Yeah,
dichotomy plays itself out here. I mean, science is not objective in that sense, right? It is also shaped by these ideas, and it's been here for several centuries, and that has undoubtedly shaped how we view things. And this is not unique to conservation, of course, in my opinion. I feel this is unique to even anthropology. Like, I was just reading this bit recently where the man the hunter and woman the gatherer idea was entirely a construct of male anthropologists and archaeologists going in and looking at this and just force fitting those ideas, and there's enough evidence to say that there was a shared role, injuries on women, bones that are clearly hunting injuries, etc., etc. So it's really important to recognize these and say that this is not only not applicable to India, but what we have in our context is, despite this, it's actually not that this doesn't explain it. It's because this doesn't exist that we have this. So I would
yeah.
definitely think and share a similar thought as you. Karan, do we need to go over the questions, because I think there are quite a few now. We don't want to run over time.
Yeah, please let us know how much time, because I think we can keep
Yeah, we
chatting.
can continue for like another 5 minutes, and then we can like head over to the Q&A session.
Okay, perfect. That
Yeah.
sounds good. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's also a lot of questions for you, Arjun. And yeah, it's so cool, I should say, like, just how many people are on this call excited to learn more about elephants. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ishika, do you have any thoughts that you would like people to think about, before we move to the questions? Any themes, any books, something that you're thinking, reading, ideas?
In terms of reading, given what we were discussing about the lifetime of a single individual, and I remember sharing this book with you now, maybe 5 years ago, Arjun, called Lord of the Grassland.
Oh,
And
yes, of course.
that, if any of you can get your hands on, and I think both Arjun and I should have a PDF. So if you don't, you can maybe reach out to one of us. It's an incredible story that follows the entire life from birth to death of a single male elephant in Assam, which also traces just the landscape changes. It's kind of a fictionalized version of the real life data that Arjun has been collecting and learning about through the eyes of both people and elephants. I think that is definitely a great read. Um, but in terms of, I guess, just things to remember and take back as thoughts, I think you created a really lovely analogy of building a house, right, Arjun? Of when we're doing conservation, it's not usually one single big solution that works. It's usually a collection of smaller efforts and experiments. And, you can only hope that even if among all those bricks, some don't really work, altogether it holds true and ultimately becomes a house. And I think that's a really beautiful analogy. So I think it's nice to keep thinking about what those bricks could be. And some of what you explained in terms of human psychology, where if there is an information deficit, is just telling them what to do and filling in that gap, is that enough? Right? Like what is really special and also complex and maybe problematic about people, elephants, all kinds of primates is that they're very unpredictable. When you have individuals and beings who are so deeply intelligent and have eccentricities, have unique personalities, uh, they can surprise you constantly. Like Luja and I have been studying about 22 gibbons for the last 5 years now. And every time we think we know them very well, we've been looking at watching them in and out, through, I mean, day in and day out, we've been uh, observing them so closely for hours and hours on end directly. But every day they're still surprising us. And in new situations, doing things we least expect them to do. And I feel like that is multiplied so much more when you're working with people. So when it comes to human psychology and, if you're doing those steps that you just mentioned, where give them information, set some rules in place so that people have to listen to them and not harm them. There are situations where that could work very well, but what are the circumstances and what are the situations in which they may not work? And what are the other bricks we will need to kind of account for how unpredictable people are and how they might interpret our interventions in conservation effort? I think those are some good things to think about when you're working with sentient species.
Absolutely. I mean, and just to kind of add one really funny one, when I was reading this marketing theory, there's this classic folk story. It's a myth, but it's one that's used to describe marketing, which is about how it can be perceived differently. Exactly what you said, which is Coca-Cola wanted to go to the Middle East and expand into the Middle East. So they created like a panel, cartoon panel, and then they showed this one guy who's really like tired in the desert and he's really, sick and he's almost going to faint. And then they showed him finding a can of Coke in the sands, and then he drinks it. And after that, he's happy and he's running and he's excited. So just to say, like, it's revitalizing, selling good times, those kind of things. And then they were all very happy and they rolled it out in the Middle East, and their sales dropped dramatically. They're like, why is this happening? This works everywhere else. And then they realize that people in the Middle East read from right to left. So it's just to say this, and I've seen. I mean, and there are lots of analogies as such in conservation as well. So
Yeah.
thanks. The questions now, right?
Yes, I think there are a lot of really good questions. So
Okay.
you should get
So
on it, Arjun.
thank you, Ishika and Arjun. That was a very wonderful conversation. I hope many of you have some so much of questions regarding, and I can see some popping in the chat box. So before we move on to the session, this session will be moderated by Miss Aksha, and And before she continues with the Q&A session, I will just introduce her. So Miss Aksha is a research fellow of National Center for Biological Sciences in Bengaluru, where she studies biodiversity and ecosystems. Her academic qualifications include a Bachelor of Science in Life Sciences from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, a postgraduate diploma in remote sensing and GIS from Savitribai Phule Pune University, and a Master of Science from NCBS TIFR Bengaluru. She has been working in the field of ecology and conservation for the last 7 years with state governments, NGOs, businesses, and research institutes, including on human-elephant interactions in South India. Through this diverse training, she wants to work on conservation of ecosystems, particularly of grasslands. She also loves to teach and engage with students whenever she can. So, handing over to Aksha for the Q&A session.
Thanks, Karan. Thanks for the introduction. Am I audible?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, you're
Thanks,
audible,
Arjun and
Aksha.
Ishika, for that wonderful conversation. And before we take the questions, I would like to put a very, very small question for Ishika. I was very curious, Ishika. Arjun spoke about a lot of push and pull factors, especially for, something that causes human-elephant conflict. I was very curious, what do you think could be the pull factors for gibbons in shared spaces?
That's actually such a great question, Aksha, because that might be one area which is actually different between elephants and gibbons so far from what we've discussed today. The push factors are definitely very similar, where they're facing a lot of habitat loss, a lot of fragmentation, and are very much at the risk of local extinctions because, um, unlike elephants, gibbons don't travel far distances and they don't really navigate as much. And, in terms of moving through their life across landscapes, they are largely territorial and don't traverse too far away from their natal spaces. Through their life. So one of the major push factors is the complete loss of habitat and just trying to find places where they can continue sustaining themselves. And we are right now very much in the early stages of understanding what the pull factors could be in different landscapes. And right now it's hard to disentangle what is just a circumstance in which they got trapped and stuck and what is a pull factor. And I think we're still very much in the early stages of figuring that out. The situations in which we are watching gibbons living alongside people living outside of forested areas, in agricultural lands, in tea gardens, and plantations, these seem to be places where gibbons were anyway living and forest was suddenly lost and the land use shifted suddenly to monocultures and they just kind of stayed back because that was their home range, that was their territory. They didn't have connectivity and they weren't able to escape that land use change. And so at present, we don't know for sure whether there are specific factors there that they are actively choosing to live with, and whether that's a pull factor or whether it's an obligatory stage, where they have nowhere else to go and there's no other habitat for them to kind of escape back into as refuge. We see that with macaques, we see that with langurs, where they move a little bit more and they might come towards croplands, have that pull factor like Arjun was talking about, that elephants face as well, where they come in and there is that pull factor, but then they retreat back into refugia places which are a little further away from people. But we don't see that as much with gibbons. There's a bit more, there's an obligate use of shared spaces there. So hopefully with time we'll be able to figure that out. I think there's not enough behavior work done with gibbons. It's all very new. So hopefully in another few years, we can have more answers for that.
Thank you, Ishika. Thank you. We'll move on to the questions. Yeah, we have quite a bit of questions for Arjun. The first question is by Pooja, and she's wondering, Arjun, can you also read the questions?
Yeah, I can read it. No
Okay,
problem.
I'll just
So, thanks.
quickly make a gist. Pooja's wondering, what is the scale of economic losses incurred by people because of elephants, and how far are we with respect to compensation? Also, are human deaths caused by elephants in this region very high? And if so, when do they occur and are they avoidable? Yeah, she's just interested because she sees a lot of elephant news and harassment in Assam.
Yeah, thanks, Pooja. This is a really interesting question. So I'll answer the three parts separately. The first one is with regard to compensation, and unfortunately, we have absolutely no idea. Partly because it's very difficult to assess this data. As you can imagine, it's across thousands of square kilometers, and there is no incentive really for people to file compensation claims or ex gratia claims because a huge chunk of them don't ever get approved. Those files are lost somewhere, they're sitting somewhere. So whatever estimate we see as reported compensation are a gross understatement. And we know this from a few sample sites, at least where we have worked and where we do have a little bit of a network, where we know that we found, I think, a majority, definitely more than half, if not more than that, who did not file for compensation for crop loss, because even the ones that got it were given like a really tiny pittance, 2,000 rupees for a hectare or something like that. So it's just not worth somebody's time because they have to get there has to be a joint assessment by the forest department and the revenue department to identify the piece of land and the extent of loss for crops. And then they need some signatures from the Gaon Budha, and then it needs to go through a bunch of different forest department offices, etc. So it just costs too much, taking the printouts, getting the Gaon Budha signature, all of that. So we don't really know. But one thing to note is that it isn't a huge number per se in terms of economic loss because this is not a cash crop. Paddy is one of the cheapest crops per hectare. I can't remember the top of my head, but some 8,000 or 10,000 a hectare at a very generous estimate, an acre at a very, very generous estimate, which is virtually nothing for the state. I remember some colleagues had done a very rough back of the envelope calculation, and it came up to a few tens of crores, not even tens of crores for the entire state of Assam, if you assume that there was 50 times or 100 times more loss than there's actually taking place, which in the scheme of things is nothing. To give you perspective, an irrigation project in just one tiny district costs a lot more. So we don't know, but yes, that doesn't mean, but that is just a macro question. At an individual level, these losses are really massive for people because it kind of leads to debt cycles, and I mean, the poor suffer a lot more because of these really crazy rates of interest, etc. Human deaths, very, very interesting question. This is also a gross understatement. In India, about 600 people are reported to die every year because of elephants. In Assam, they say about 50 people to 100 people a year. This is definitely a gross understatement, and we know this because there was this huge bit of work that was done by WWF and colleagues a few years ago, where they went to every single department, forest office, range office in the state and in a few districts, and physically sifted through the records to look at human deaths. And they found that there were more deaths than those reported even to the ministry and the official stats. And I think from personal experience, I can say as well that a lot of deaths go unreported, sometimes due to political, or not political, but administrative reasons. So, for instance, if an individual dies in an area which is technically within a protected area, those deaths are not really recorded because it doesn't make sense to, because people are not able to file for compensation. And we know this, for instance, for a couple of years where we kept a pulse on a place where we were working at very closely, there were, in our knowledge, about eight human deaths due to elephants. But for the same year, the official report was four. So, of course, I don't think we can extrapolate that to the entire region, but that's something to think about. And why elephants see so much news? It's and harassment, I guess. It's a little sobering to know that this is also, one of those classic PR things what media houses do. I mean, it's such a dramatic thing to, continuously focus on something like this. And a lot of these are undoubtedly avoidable. Several of the deaths that have taken place have been for people who were under the influence of alcohol, who were inebriated and went out and essentially ran into an elephant. Somebody charged an elephant. This happened in front of me, actually. A drunk person charged the elephant. Fortunately, he slipped before he could reach the elephant. But these kind of things. So sometimes you think that this is the elephant show an incredible amount of restraint. And Assam's case, I feel personally, I don't have any evidence to say this, but I feel that it's also a very striking image, right? Where people and elephants are sharing such close proximity, including through highly developed areas, which is not what you see in other parts of the country as much. Of course, you do see it in South India as well. But yeah, so I think those are some of the answers to your question. Yeah.
Thanks, Arjun. That's really interesting. And thank you, Pooja, for your question. We'll move on to Shraddha's question. And she's curious to know if there are any studies or evidence that show regional differences in elephant behavior towards humans. Like, for example, there could be lower tolerance in Northeast India when you compare it with South India. Or does it have to do with individual elephant personalities?
Right. Thanks. Thanks, Radha. That's a really interesting question. And I think that there is a lot more work done on this particular aspect from South India than Northeast India. For instance, there is Nishant Srinivasaya's work with frontier elephants, which is looking at individual elephants, behaviors towards different landscapes. And there is also, I think, the Shola Trust's work by Tarsh Tekekara, and they have an 8-minute, 16-second video on YouTube which describes the different types of elephants. So, which they've categorized as different traits. They're like type 1, type 2, type 3, from ones and type 4. Ones that are completely scared of humans and human areas and don't enter human use areas at all, and the others that are completely habituated. So I think that's something that has some idea, and they also have had a brilliant project. I think it was called Jumbo Radar, where they were looking at individual elephants and their individual traits and trying to see how that can inform interventions. Again, that was South India. Northeast India, there's a little bit of work that is being done. I don't know whether it's still out or published yet, which is done by the Conservation Initiatives team. Parvati is, I think, leading that work, which is looking at this. So I don't really know whether there is any difference. I can't compare it really, but I do feel that at least initially and very broadly, we do see that there are similar traits, like the ones I was talking about with Arikomban, Chinnathambi, Ramu, and there are a bunch of other elephants as well, where they're getting more habituated to these human use areas, and at the same time are not antagonistic towards humans despite being provoked. So I think that's something really interesting. And at this point, I think I also want to just draw the attention of people here to Pooja and Shraddha's work in Pake, which is looking at, it's called Pakidam Partnerships, and you can follow it online on social media, where they're looking at how they can use a more humane system for training elephants and for having captive elephants using positive reinforcement. So I think that's also something really interesting, which can also, if anybody is interested, shed more light on the individual differences between elephants to similar stimulus.
Thanks, Arjun. Thank you. And thank you, Shraddha, for your question. So the next question is by Lakshmana, and he's wondering if there are any socio-political nuances in human-elephant conflict, especially communities who face caste, class, and other forms of discrimination may have a higher risk of conflict than other people. And would that influence perspectives on elephants as well?
Thanks. And I think I'd just like to combine this with Himangshu's work. And then, of course, Ishika, please jump in for the Gibbons part as well, which is just a question below. And I think there is definitely some work done on this. And for instance, the most salient and the most striking that comes to mind is that of the Adivasi tree tribe community in Assam, who share a lot of space with elephants, and I think bear a huge cost of sharing spaces like this, because they are It's a huge population of people, close to 5 million people in this community, of which quite a few, quite a large aspect, I think, also share spaces with elephants. They were brought as indentured labor from eastern and central India to work on the tea estates by the British, and their conditions are abysmally poor. I feel personally that this is one of the single greatest organized human rights violations in the country, where they are paid well below minimum wage using legal loophole, if I may call it that. That's a tangent, but of course we can talk more about that as well. So socially, they are also severely marginalized. And the reason I combined Himanshu's question with this as well is because gender as well plays a role. There's some work from Udalguri and other parts of Assam where they say that women also have a different kind of conflict from compared to men, and often it's a much more intensely felt one. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. And it also makes working in these systems very important. For instance, it's so easy to just have like an enforcement, but it just ends up making people much worse off. And that's not sustainable or healthy or humane or just. So I think this is something that definitely needs to be thought of. And once we start working in this landscape, it's particularly the aspect of different ethnicities is impossible to ignore, especially if you're working on human-elephant conflicts. It just hits you so hard in the face that you can't see. I mean, on all these metrics that we use to understand how people are faring, human development index, infant mortality, lifespans, all of those things are much worse for the T-tribe community than people they literally share an imaginary fence with, who live on the other side. And we do have a lot of diversity in this, of communities. I mean, in the district that I spent a lot of time in, Sonitpur, there are 101 dialects spoken, which just goes to show the kind of diversity that there is. So yeah, those are my opinions and thoughts on this. Ishika, maybe you want to talk about the Gibbons bit?
Sure, yeah. I mean, honestly, this is very true regardless of species. Whichever species you're looking at, I completely agree with what you said, Arjun. I think there's just so much here, and I'm glad you kind of linked Himanshu's question in as well here, because you can't look at gender in isolation. I think it's the reason why men and women often have very different perspectives and opinions goes hand in hand with what their societal roles are, and those societal roles are shaped by caste and what kind of systems they're working in, what their religions require them to be, which communities or tribes people might hail from, and what the roles of a woman in the household versus a man in the household are, because very often it is those roles that directly translate into how much interaction they might have with a particular species, right? If depending on what a woman is doing, if she comes into contact more with a particular animal, her perspectives are going to be very different, and it's the same for men. So when it comes to gibbons, we see definitely differences there, where uh, women seem to have a lot more nuanced emotion, perspective, opinion, and also just plain ecological knowledge about gibbons, because they're often they spend more time in the village. They seem to observe more closely. They seem to not just see what they're doing, but try to interpret and dissect why they're doing what they're doing. Men seem to have more fleeting relationships with the gibbons because they don't spend as much time watching them or in the same physical space. And so, what ends up happening is those fleeting interactions get generalized over a larger period of time. And so, overall, the more ecological and ethological observations and perspectives that they have are more general, while so a lot of women have more specific insights sometimes. So that's something we definitely see. And then there are also some differences in terms of the large buckets in which these perceptions lie. We find men to be a lot more, leaning towards what are the laws, what are the logical explanations for gibbons' behaviors and activities and foraging patterns. And a lot of their sentiments and emotions revolve around that. For women, a lot of it is based on direct first-hand experiences, observations of their behavior, and a lot of emotion and sentiment does play a role. And the laws and logic don't always come in as prominently. But yeah, I completely agree that it's not gender in isolation because that's an oversimplification. If you only say men do this, women do that, it's not true. It breaks down completely. A lot of that could also just depend on our positionality as researchers. If I were to speak to one of Arjun's male respondents about his experiences with elephants, it's extremely possible that he might open up emotionally a lot more to me and pour his heart out about how much he enjoys watching elephants play. And perhaps with Arjun, he focused on the more economic aspects of the losses he's faced with elephants. And that's because of how he perceived Arjun versus me. So I think there's a lot more here that is not necessarily gender based. Some of it is just the experiences people have had and how that then in turn intersects with what their class, caste are, what community they hail from, what religion they follow, and whether they've had positive or negative experiences with that animal. Um, so yeah, definitely a lot of differences when it comes to gender and how people's livelihoods impact how often they interact with animals. That definitely leaves you with differing perceptions and opinions.
Thank you, Arjun and Ishika. That's really interesting and a very good question. Thanks, Imanshu and Lakshmana. And I think we have the last question for today, which is by Linesha. She is wondering if there is any scope for sound technology that can be implemented to keep elephants away or warn them of a particular region.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There are some acoustic deterrents that are suggested to work, but I am a little skeptical of them because elephants are very, very intelligent, and so, for instance, the railways had a huge project, Project B, Plan B, or something like that, where they said we want to keep elephants away from railway tracks because they were getting hit by trains. So they will play the sound of bees from speakers before, whenever there's an elephant around or before a train's going to come. And it worked the first couple of times. But after that, the elephants just got used to it, because they realized that this is all bark and no bite. So it's very difficult. And some other people in the landscape tried it as well. And after a couple of days, the farmer said, after a couple of weeks, the farmer said, it worked well at first, but फिर लगता है कि हम हाथी के लिए कीर्तन भजन गा रहे हैं, which means we're like playing music for the elephants because they've figured out that this is again just a trick, and that's really important because we need to take into account the learning process of these elephants, right? They're not static animals; they are also highly intelligent. If it was coupled with a little bit of a negative stimulus every now and then, it might have worked, which is exactly how fences work. These non-lethal fences, they're psychological barriers. It doesn't really harm the animal, and that's what's happened in South India. So not even sound, something as visceral as an electric shock has stopped working because people realized that this works. That being said, there is some work that's being done to understand elephants communicate a lot through sound, including infrasonically, things that we can't hear. There is some work being done to figure out whether you can pick up on elephant speech like this, speaking amongst themselves to see whether they're planning to approach a human area or not. There's some work that's being done in Assam, in Kaziranga by Seema Lokhandwala, who's got a project on this if you're interested. And there's a huge amount of work that's been done in Africa looking at elephant acoustics. So that's again something that can be worth checking out, but I don't think anything will really work to keep elephants away through sound. I mean, they get used to firecrackers. Elephants like Ramu, if when somebody would throw a firecracker at him to scare him, he would lift his foot, let the firecracker fall, it would burst, and then he would put his foot down. So I don't think a sound really would work.
Thanks, Arjun. And I think Tarun has an interesting question. He says that, hi, Arjun, I know you've not been in Assam lately, but is the Forest Department considering shipping problem elephants to Vantara?
I don't know about this. It's very difficult to say. Because there are a lot of discussions definitely on how to deal with challenging elephants, with problem elephants, with rogue elephants, and the idea that, they can be shipped off is very enticing to people because it makes it seem like a techno managerial problem where you just push it away and it's out of the scene. And one of the striking things in this is that, including the slides that I shared previously of Chinnathambi and Arikomban, is like we will domesticate them, which is wrong. This is untrue. You cannot, and elephants are not domestic. I really don't feel we should get caught up on the semantics, which is something I don't really agree with. But I feel here it is a vital distinction to make a distinction between captive elephants and captive animals and domesticated animals. So captive elephants and captive animals are those that are subdued by the use of force to act in a certain way, which is like elephants. And domesticated ones refer to ones where there has been a genetic shift and certain traits have been selected for through selective breeding, etc., which is like goats and dogs and sheep and horses and cats. But elephants are not like that. So this definition is very ambiguous, to start with, and it's very difficult to understand what happens behind closed doors in forest department meetings and discussions. We don't know. I mean, I'm sure you've seen that there have been a few changes to the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 for 5 decades. Since 1972 to 2022, the law was going in a particular direction, with regards to exotic animals, with regards to elephants, with regards to many other things, developmental or uh, wildlife activities within protected areas, etc. And suddenly it's been changed, and there hasn't been a great rationale behind it. Of course, we've got some snippets, but it's very difficult. And I feel this question is very interesting because it makes us think about what are the decision-making processes, what are the factors that have been in place. The minutes that are published as part of state wildlife and national wildlife boards is very it's a very condensed form, so we don't really know what exactly happened. So I'm not qualified, and I don't think I have the right information to address this.
Thank you. I think you've answered all the questions. And before we close, if there are any comments, any insights, anything that you'd like to share, otherwise we can close the session. I think there's one more question has come up for Arjun. Should we take it? Probably we should keep this as the last question since it's almost 8 o'clock. And so Danet asks, is it possible to induce tolerance into culture to promote coexistence? And are there any examples?
This is a very interesting question, and I will keep it brief because I know we're running out of time. But the core idea is, yes, there are ways in which we can help create these win-win outcomes for wildlife and people. And I think a classic example that comes to mind is that of leopards in Mumbai, which is also very well documented in case you're interested in learning. The highest density of leopards is in the heart of the city of Mumbai, with a population of 23 million people sharing space with about 50 odd leopards, with the numbers with I think 26 or 32 leopards per 100 square kilometers. In wildlife sanctuaries, it's about 4 or 5 per 100 square kilometers. So it's disproportionately high, which people believe is largely due to the abundance of food in the form of street dogs that are available to leopards, etc. But they share spaces with people who you would never imagine would be okay with having a large big cat sharing spaces with them. Highly mobile, urban people working in corporate offices, etc. But there's been a lot of work that has worked with people, with the media, on how to frame narratives, messaging, how to shift the focus from just the leopard to human behavior that is causing leopards to be at such high numbers, and how to keep yourself safe. So, also there have been virtually no lethalities of humans due to leopards in the past several years because of these interventions. And I think you can read about this in Project Waghoba, Vidyatraya, Nikit Survey, and WCS India's work. There's a lot of work that's been done on that, and there are lots of blog posts and a really beautiful photo series in Nat Geo as well on this by Steve Winter.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants for attending and asking wonderful questions. Thanks, Arjun, for the great talk. Thank you, Ishika, for sharing your insights on gibbons. And thank you to both of you for having the wonderful and very, interesting conversation. Thanks, Karan, for taking this event forward. And hopefully everyone enjoyed. And I think it's time to close. It's 8 o'clock. And see you at the next Friends of Elephants session.
So much, Aksha.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Aksha.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay,
everyone.
bye.